In December 1944, when many believed Nazi Germany was already weakening, Hitler launched one last massive gamble through the Ardennes. It was sudden, violent, and designed to split the Allied lines before they could react. Snow covered the forests, roads disappeared under ice and mud, communication broke down, entire units were forced backward. For a few terrifying days, it looked as if the Germans had found a way to turn the war around. And at the center of that chaos stood one place they needed to take quickly: Bastogne. It was not the biggest city in Europe. It was not the most famous. But it mattered because roads mattered. Bastogne sat at a critical crossroads, and in a winter offensive built on speed, armor, and surprise, control of those roads could shape everything. If Germany captured it fast enough, its forces could keep pushing west with momentum. If they lost time there, the entire offensive could begin to stall. That is why the town became so important. It was not just another point on a map. It was a hinge on which a larger gamble could turn. American forces rushed into the area under brutal conditions. Among them were paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, men already respected for toughness, but now facing something worse than a normal battle. They arrived exhausted, under-equipped for the winter, and with little time to prepare. The ground was frozen. Artillery thundered across the woods. German armor and infantry were pushing from multiple directions. Yet the order was clear: hold Bastogne. Soon, the town was surrounded. That changed the battle immediately. The problem was no longer just enemy fire. It was isolation. Supplies ran low, medical stations filled with wounded men. Ammunition had to be used carefully. The weather was so bad that Allied air support could do little at first, and the men inside the perimeter had to endure not only attack, but cold so severe that it became a second enemy. Frostbite, exhaustion, hunger, and uncertainty pressed in from every side. Under those conditions, many surrounded forces in history have collapsed. Bastogne did not. What made the defense so remarkable was not that the Americans were comfortable, confident, or untouched by fear. It was the opposite. They were under pressure constantly. German artillery hammered their positions. Patrols probed the perimeter. Tanks appeared where they were least wanted. Rumors spread. Lines bent. Men died in foxholes half filled with snow. This was not a clean, heroic painting. It was a freezing, violent struggle in which survival itself became part of discipline. The Germans believed Bastogne could be crushed or forced to surrender. That belief was not unreasonable. Encircled troops are supposed to weaken. They are supposed to run short of food, short of ammunition, short of hope. And from the outside, the position must have seemed desperate. A surrounded American force, cut off in winter, under relentless pressure, looked like the kind of situation that breaks men. But there is a difference between looking broken and actually surrendering. Inside Bastogne, officers and enlisted men understood the stakes. If the town held, the German timetable suffered. If the timetable suffered, the larger offensive lost momentum. So the defense became something larger than survival. Every hour mattered. Every roadblock mattered. Every machine gun nest, every artillery adjustment, every stubborn refusal to abandon a position bought time the Germans could not easily replace. And time, in the Ardennes, was becoming one of the most valuable weapons on the battlefield. By then, every hour of resistance carried a cost for Germany. Fuel was being burned. Schedules were being ruined. The weather that trapped the Americans also complicated the attackers. Commanders who needed speed were being forced into delay, and delay in the Ardennes was poison to the larger plan. Bastogne was no longer just an obstacle. It was becoming a wound the offensive could not afford. That was the real danger. Then came the demand for surrender. The Germans sent a message calling on the Americans to give up warning of total destruction if they refused. Under normal conditions, that threat might have carried enormous weight. Bastogne was surrounded. The shelling was real. Casualties were real. The danger of annihilation was not invented. Yet the answer that came back became legendary for a reason. It was short, blunt, and unforgettable. Nuts. That single word captured more than defiance. It captured the mood of a force that understood how close it was to disaster and still refused to accept the logic of surrender. Bastogne was not holding because conditions were favorable. It was holding because the men there decided that the Germans would have to take every frozen yard the hard way, and that decision would change far more than one town. After the surrender demand was rejected, the battle entered a harsher phase. The Germans kept attacking. Artillery struck again and again. Infantry probed weak points. Armor searched for breaks in the line. The Americans answered with everything they had, under conditions that would have broken less determined troops. Ammunition remained precious. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Men fought while cold, hungry, exhausted, and uncertain whether relief would arrive in time. Bastogne held, but holding came at a brutal price. What made the defense even more impressive was that it was never some effortless display of confidence. It was a struggle measured in minutes, shells, and human endurance. Positions had to be maintained under constant pressure. Officers had to make decisions with incomplete information. Artillerymen had to fire accurately despite weather and confusion. Medics worked in conditions that were barely imaginable. Every part of the defense was being tested at once, and none of it came easy. The weather had been one of Germany's greatest allies in the opening phase of the offensive. Low clouds and winter storms reduced Allied air power and added to the confusion on the ground. But weather can shift, and when it did, the balance began to change. Skies cleared enough for Allied aircraft to appear. Supplies could be dropped. Air attacks began hitting German positions, roads, and vehicles. Men in Bastogne who had endured isolation suddenly had proof that they had not been abandoned. That mattered physically, but it also mattered psychologically. Relief is a weapon when men have been living on the edge of exhaustion. Ammunition, medical supplies, and food helped them survive, but hope helped them endure. The German side now faced a problem beyond casualties. The defenders were still there, still organized, still dangerous, and the longer they remained in place, the more damage they did to the larger offensive timetable. Meanwhile, outside the encirclement, Allied commanders were already working to break through. General Patton's Third Army turned north in one of the most famous maneuvers of the war, driving through difficult winter conditions to reach the trapped defenders. That movement alone says something important about Bastogne. Armies do not redirect major efforts casually. They do it when a place matters, and Bastogne mattered enough to justify extraordinary speed and determination. When relief finally came, it did not erase what had happened inside the perimeter. The men who held Bastogne had already done what was required. They had denied the Germans a quick victory. They had forced time to work against the attackers rather than for them. They had turned what was supposed to be a rapid thrust into a slower, bloodier struggle. And in a campaign built on momentum, that was devastating. This is why Bastogne matters far beyond the legend of one famous reply. Nuts became iconic because it was memorable, but the real story is larger than a single word. It is about discipline under encirclement. It is about command under pressure. It is about men who understood that every hour of resistance weakened a larger enemy plan. The defense of Bastogne did not win the Battle of the Bulge by itself, but it helped break the offensive's rhythm when rhythm was everything. Germany had hoped the Ardennes offensive would split the Allied front, capture critical ground, and create enough political and military shock to change the course of the war in the West. Instead, Resistance at places like Bastogne bought time for the Allies to recover, reorganize, and counterattack. The gamble that began with surprise and violence gradually lost its speed. Once that happened, Germany's chances fell with it. There is a reason veterans and historians speak of Bastogne with a certain tone. It was not simply dramatic, it was clarifying. It revealed what happens when trained men decide that isolation is not defeat, that cold is not surrender, and that pressure is not collapse. Bastogne proved that a surrounded force could still shape the battlefield outside its own perimeter. That is rare, and in wartime, rare things become unforgettable. In the end, Bastogne was more than a town in winter. It was a test of will at exactly the moment Germany needed easy success. Instead, it found resistance. Hard, disciplined, freezing resistance. The Americans inside the perimeter were supposed to break. They did not. They were supposed to surrender. They did not. They were supposed to become one more obstacle swept aside by the last great German gamble. Instead, they became one of the reasons that gamble failed. When Germany looked at Bastogne, it saw a target. What it found was refusal. And in that refusal was something stronger than snow, shells, and fear. Time stolen from an offensive that could not afford to lose it. That is why Bastogne still matters. Not because it was easy, but because it held when holding seemed impossible.